My name is Myrna Lashley. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University. The paper deals with the way that we haven't really been collecting race-based data on COVID. And it talks about the fact that people have been made to feel as though they are, somewhat subordinate, and they have actually internalized that. And that is detrimental to people's mental health. It's detrimental, is a major determinant of of health in terms of racism. We know that that is one of the big determinants of health. And the paper is actually a plea to collect race-based data and to understand that a lot of people who are working on the front line are the ones, they're living in multi-generational homes sometimes. They can't take the time off. Sometimes they have to do 2 or 3 jobs in order to put food on the table. And we're not being very considerate of those people.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so now we'll get into the interview. So how do you define systemic racism based on your extensive professional and personal experiences?
Well, systemic racism, and thank you for the question, actually. Systemic racism hasn't got to be, a lot of people seem to think it's something in the system that's written down somewhere in their system that says, do not do this for disabled people, or do not do this for people of color. That's not what it is. This is something that is based on 17th century colonialism and is in what we refer to as white ideology. It's not talking about white people versus black people. A lot of people think you're attacking white people. We're not attacking anybody. We're saying that the way the society was structured, which gave one group dominance and told them that they were dominant over all of other groups, is based in an ideology of whiteness, since the dominance was given to those who have pale skin, and all others, not just black people, all others were placed below what Fanon refers to as a horizontal line, and they were placed below that line, constantly struggling to get out from under that line and to come up. Therefore, it is a system that was created in the 17th century and which we have all inherited, those above the line and those below the line. And it's the system within which we all live.
Okay, thank you so much for that. On to the second question. The Quebec government still refuses to acknowledge the systemic nature of racism. Mm-hmm. What do you believe is the reason for this reluctance?
I think they probably don't understand, really, because I've heard them say, we don't have anything written down in our system that says you can't do this or you can't do that. I think there's a fear. There's a reluctance to want to accept, that Canada, including Quebec, had slavery. There's a reluctance to accept that there are the dominant and the so-called subordinates, that the line has created that. And I think it's frightening. I think a lot of people think that if they make that acknowledgement that the society is going to fall apart. My attitude is, if your society is that fragile, then you've got a big problem. But the thing is, the society is not that fragile. And you have to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations. You have to be willing to look at this. Otherwise, this division is just going to get wider and wider, because what's happening is that you've got one side saying there is no racism, there is no systemic racism, and they're buckling in. And on the other side, you've got people say, how dare you not accept my reality? You don't like me. And they're buckling in. So by not acknowledging it, you're not solving the problem, you're actually making it worse.
In your paper, you state that although universal healthcare is available to all Canadians, mm-hmm. this does not guarantee an equal understanding of illness, distress, or treatment. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a bit about some of the inequities racialized groups face in our healthcare system?
Well, there's a whole issue of just having access to the care that they need. In order to have access to the care that you need access to caregiver who understands what your needs are. And again, because it's seen only through the lens of whiteness, people think that they don't have to look at the social aspects. They just look at the somatic issues and say, oh, you're depressed, therefore I can write this prescription for you. If you don't look at the social issues and what that does to a person, how that wears down that person, how it attacks their sense of dignity, how it attacks their humanity, you're not giving good care if you don't understand what people's reality is. You've got people who think that it's that Black people, for example, won't catch COVID because there's something about the melanin content in their skin or the thickness of their skin that's going to mean they don't feel pain or they won't catch an illness. You're not giving good care. You know, we could look through history. We all women like having a gynecologist to go to. But the fact is that how many of us know that that what we have achieved through gynecology and the perfection of gynecology was done through Black bodies, through Black women's bodies. And, you know, they made these women go on their knees and actually push their hands and other things into them and felt around inside there without anesthesia. And they had no choice, these women. The specular, everything was put into them, and hands and bits of them were pulled out and pulled out. And the belief was they don't feel pain. But it makes sense when you think of them and say, well, they're animals. But of course, animals feel pain. And when you go back to them and say, well, they're 3/5 of a person, well, if you dehumanize people, then it's easy for you to say they don't feel pain. So that has continued, and the teachings, what we teach in medical school and psychology school and all the health areas has been taught from a perspective of Western medicine, which did not take into consideration the needs of indigenous people, the needs of people of color, the needs of Black. None of this was taken into consideration because Blackness or anything other than whiteness was always seen through the eyes of whiteness, just as treating women was seen through the eyes of men. And now we're seeing that readjustment taking place. So it's the same thing. How can you treat someone when you don't understand their reality? That is the issue.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to touch a little bit about what you had just mentioned, that you discuss in your paper about the belief that Black people's genetic makeup, including melanin levels, renders them immune to the virus. Mm-hmm. So why do you think that these kinds of myths gain traction, and how can we counter this type of misinformation?
Well, it gains traction because it's seen through the eyes of whiteness, and since no one, they really pay attention to Black people as human beings, as full-fledged human beings, but as something upon whom you can experiment, and that they're seen through the eyes of whiteness. They look at our skins and say, oh, well, that Blackness, that veneer of Blackness somehow gives them immunity. It can't penetrate their skin, which is a silly thing to say, but it was the way Black people were viewed, and that the more melanin you had, presumably, the fewer viruses could enter into. I mean, it doesn't even make logical or scientific sense. But people were willing to believe that because you don't question. If you don't question it, then it is. And if you're a professor, if you've always been taught this, it gets passed down. Now, I don't think that any professor today is actually teaching that. But the question is, how many professors are refuting it? It's not whether they're teaching it. It's how many of them are refuting it. There's the issue. So if you don't refute it, it gets passed down as though it still obtains. The other side of that is because Black people, anyone not white, has been conditioned to live below the line. People have internalized a sense of inferiority. People have internalized that I don't belong here. This is not for me. They have all the power. And so some Black people actually internalize that also and say, oh, I can't get the virus because of the melanin. But who told them that? Those who have the power. told them that, and so people believed it. And then, of course, once people who were working in the homes were dying and getting the virus, and then being blamed for taking it from one home to the other because society was structured such that they had to have 3 or 4 jobs, because they're not getting paid a decent salary, and you're not a full-time employee, so you work a few hours here, you go to somewhere else. Then it's finally dawned on people, oh my goodness gracious, I can get sick, and who's here looking after me? And because we don't gather the data, we don't even know what to do with it. People have been reluctant to gather the data by saying, oh, well, if we gather the data, it means that we're racist. That is nonsense. Gathering the data gives you the information you need so that you can put policies and procedures in place and treatment. And let us even argue, for the sake of argument, let us even say that it was a truth that Black people, that people with more melanin didn't get the virus. It still leaves the question of how come it's therefore seeping through? What is the mechanism? I mean, no matter how you do this, you still have to get those data so that you can make appropriate healthcare decisions.
Yeah, definitely. I have a question here that's just about that. If maybe you can reiterate, why is race-based data collection important in public health in general and to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in particular?
Well, as I said, you need to have the data if you're going to get treatment in place. The data, and when you get this data, I think, we haven't got the data yet, but 9 out of 10 times, I'm telling you, you're going to find, because we share 99.8% of our genes, is more than likely going to say it's got nothing to do with melanin. It's got to do with social conditions. If you do that and you find out that it's really social conditions, which I am convinced it is, most of us researchers know darn well that it is. If you find out that it's social, then you've got to do something about it. Mm-hmm. You don't get to just sit there and say, yeah, it's racism, it's poverty, it's economics, it's education, it's all these other things, but we're not going to do anything about it. We're only going to care about people with lighter pigmentation. Those we're going to make sure that so you're stuck. And for some people, it may be that they don't want to get those data, because then what are we going to do with it once we've got that information?
And which groups do you believe are most affected by healthcare disparities during this pandemic, and why?
Well, I think that certainly the aged, those people over, the aged who are those who are ill, because you can be aged and not ill. So if you're aged and you're not ill, you've got multiple organ problems, you've got multiple problems, they are certainly at risk. Certainly the people working in, who are working in les maisons de longue durée, those folks who have to go, as I said, from place to place to work, because they can't afford to work in just one place. There's not enough work to do that, so they have to go from one home to another. And there are a lot of those are people of color. Certainly, a lot of nurses, a lot of people in the healthcare industry actually are people of color. You've got Filipinos, you've got Black people, you've got Asians. So they're highly at risk. And certainly, all healthcare professionals that are working in primary situations, the nurses and the doctors, and they're at risk. And that's why, even if we don't wear the mask and wash our hands for ourselves, for goodness sake, we owe it to these people who are putting their lives on the line to look after us. We owe them to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. What are some of the reasons for the high mortality and morbidity of COVID-19 amongst racialized people in Quebec?
Well, again, if you are in a multi-generational home, where do you escape to when you come home from work? Where do you say, well, I'm going to lock myself up here? I mean, am I going to lock myself off in the basement, but I might have somebody sleeping down there. It might be an apartment for someone. So how do you isolate? You have to get up and go back to work, you've got to put food on the table. As I said, you may be working in many localities. That puts you at risk. And you know, your kids, the kids aren't in school and they need help with their homework. But if, let's say, you're a single parent, who's going to help them with their homework? You can't isolate. You've got to be exposed to your children. You will be exposing your children and other people in the household to it. And let's say you have 3 adults working in the home, but they're all working in jobs where they have to go and they work in several jobs, or even if they're not, but they have to go out. They don't have a choice. But when they come home, there's nowhere to isolate. You know, there's no bedroom off somewhere that's yours alone, or the kitchen that's off somewhere alone, or a basement where you're not in contact with other people. You come through a different door and you've got a bathroom and everything down there in a small kitchenette, so that you never have to see the people upstairs. If you're not living in that kind of situation, of course you're going to be exposed. If you're exposed, you run the risk of high morbidity and high mortality.
Mm-hmm. Data confirms that immigrants and racialized people are overrepresented in jobs with high risk of COVID-19 infection.
Yes.
And there is often a lack of personal protective equipment and inadequate working conditions. What can we do to ensure the safety of these workers?
Well, I don't know what we can do, but I know the government has to acknowledge it. And if the government acknowledges it, then they have to make sure that they've got the PPEs, the personal protective equipment that they need. We've got to give people decent jobs and pay them a decent wage so that they don't have to go and work 3 or 4 jobs. That's one thing. You know, we've got to treat all people equally and with equity, not just equally, but with equity. We've got to recognize that if we're going to ask these people, you're here, but why don't you, you might be here illegally, but how about you go and work in this place? If they go and work in this place, after it's finished, are we going to give them citizenship? Are we going to make sure they've got jobs? There's a whole plethora of things that have to be put in place. We can't keep using people. Yes, it's a disproportionate amount of people who are working in the jobs, and therefore a disproportionate amount of people who are exposed to the virus. And then what do we do?
The pandemic is an added stressor on top of the daily discrimination and racism Black people face. How is this pandemic further impacting their mental health?
Oh my goodness gracious. Well, the pandemic is first of all, we talked about morbidity and mortality to which people are exposed. And then when, on top of that, you've got the overlayer of racism to deal with, yours and what's happening to your kids and what's happening to your family and what's happening in society, and no one's listening to you. And you're saying to them, look, there is systemic racism. No, there's not. There's racism. No, there's not. That's more stressful. You're adding stress on top of stress. So you're stressed because of the pandemic. Then you're stressed because of racism. And then you're stressed because people are saying, well, it's your fault that this virus is traveling because you're working in several homes. You're working in 3 or 4 maisons de longue durée. Well, for goodness sake, pay me a decent salary, give me a full-time job, you know, help me, and then I won't have to do that. So it's pressure on pressure on pressure on pressure. So of course, you're carrying more than your burden. Then you're carrying the burden of being a female in that society. You're carrying the burden of being a Black female. You're carrying the burden of, as I said, multi-generational homes. You're carrying economic burdens. You're carrying professional burdens. It's so intersectional. All these intersections, of course, is going to wear you. Mm-hmm. My concern, and one of the concerns I have, is that we're starting to see higher rates of suicide among this population. Because, and then you're trying your best to help people, and you're being blamed for traveling the virus. I mean, come on. People don't know what to do. They've got to blame somebody, they think. So they blame the very people who are trying to help them and who are living at the bottom of the scale.
Mm-hmm. What measures or initiatives do you believe that can be helpful in confronting systemic racism? And what can be done by governments and civil society to properly address and combat systemic racism and healthcare inequities?
Well, let's try and unpack some of that. First of all, we have to look at the way we train our medical professionals or healthcare professionals, all of us. We have to look at the way we train. We have to look at the messages we send, who we are, how we expect our society to be, and how we train our professionals. We've got to get away from, do you know the acronym of WEIRD, W-E-I-R-D? Well, WEIRD stands for Western Education, Industrial, Rich, Democratic. And we've put everything through that prism. We've got to get away from that and recognize that that is only one way to see the world. People come with different things, different modalities of learning, different types of government. Not everyone comes from the background from which we come. We've got to understand that what we're teaching is very much a Eurocentric model. So we've got to change the way we teach. We've got to change not so much the way we teach, but what we're teaching. We've got to take a look at that. We've got to take a look at our textbooks. Are we looking at other types of knowledge? Are we incorporating that into our teaching? Are we asking other people who come before us, what do you know? How do you do things in your own home? This is part of the cultural formulation that we teach. How are things going? Government has to stop, it has to take its head out of the sand and stop pretending that racism doesn't exist. Because as long as government keeps saying that and sending that message, then people have a pass. They can say, I don't have to change. I don't have to change the way I teach. My government tells me that what you guys are talking about is rubbish. It doesn't exist. And it's easier for people to say that because it puts very little strain on you if you can continue the way things are. People have, all of us, we've got to be willing to have the difficult conversations. We've got to be willing to have those very uncomfortable conversations. We've got to be willing to look at ourselves, look at what we were taught, look at our parents, look at our grandparents, our great-grandparents. This doesn't mean that you stop speaking to your parents and your great-grandparents, but you may have to decide that these are things I don't talk to you about because we're never going to agree on this. And I love you. We're going to stick to these narrow things, but these other things over here, no, I'm going to work on that. We have to look at the messages we send to our children and our relatives. We have to look at the books we read. Are we reading only books from our own culture, or are we trying to expand our knowledge and learning about other people? What toys are we buying for our kids? Are we only buying toys from our own culture, or are we exposing them? What kind of stories? What are the fairy tales we're telling our kids? Only one set, only Western things based on Western modalities and Western thought? Or are we exposing them? It calls for reflection. We call for personal reflection. It calls for personal introspection. All of these things have to take place if we're going to change society. And then we have to join with our fellow human being. We have to stop dehumanizing people and join with our fellow human being to make this world better than we found, and certainly leave it better than we found it.